looks right, throws a deep pass, right side, end zone, it's caught, it's a touchdown. And the Cardinals continue to pour it on.
Welcome to Cardinals Underground.
All right, guys, you'll know we've made significant progress towards a return to normalcy, or at least enter the next phase of this football season when we go back to having zero in common with NFL coaches. Right now, we have one thing in common with NFL coaches, that is we're still working from home, right? At least Cardinals coaches, Darren Urban, Kyle Odegard, yours truly, Paul Calvisi. And by the way, the mustache this week, Kyle, I'm going to beat you to it. This honors Bobby Valentine because this week back in 1999, Bobby Valentine, then Mets manager, was kicked out of a game, came back into the dugout rocking a fake mustache and sunglasses. I think it was the 13th inning at about 1 a.m. So it was a bit conspicuous there with the sunglasses. But I just, to this day, hope that Major League Baseball punished him severely because, you know, a mustache should never be used for ill-gotten gains like that.
It's funny you bring that up, Paul, because you mentioned Bobby Valentine in 1999. That was the last year that I did not cover the Cardinals full time. I did them as a backup reporter at the time, and I was doing a lot of different stuff. And I ended up covering the Diamondbacks in the playoffs against the Mets. And the way the schedule worked out, there was a playoff game at night in Arizona. And then when the game was over, our crew at the Tribune, we had to take the red eye all night to get to New York. We get to New York, you know, late in the morning because you're traveling all night. Took a long nap, and then we had to get over to like a 5 o'clock availability. And I was covering the Mets because I was covering the opposing team right then. I was going to do a story on Bobby Valentine. I wanted to ask him about his time at Arizona State because he was there. And I will never forget, I went up there and there was like a group of us, and I asked him something about Arizona State. And he looked at me like, why the hell are you asking me about this? Get the hell away from me. And he gave me some really short, completely worthless answer. And I'm like, okay. So that's my big Bobby Valentine story from 1999. I think
he dealt with the New York media on a daily basis, right? So, I mean, he had no problem just brushing off any kind of pesky media question. He was grizzled. There's no doubt about that. Kyle, did you ever cover baseball, by the way? You ever a baseball beat writer?
Not a beat writer, but I did a lot of backup Diamondbacks. And when you're a backup baseball writer, you're there, 4 days a week anyways. So back when Justin Upton, Mark Reynolds, Chris Young, those D-backs teams, I was around quite a bit.
Those are some good guys. That was a good clubhouse. Sure. Yeah, no doubt. So we heard from Kliff Kingsbury this week, and the reason they're still working at home, obviously, is the pandemic. But it went beyond that. The gravity of the social unrest and everything that was going on. And Kliff Kingsbury met the media, and he acknowledged that football is secondary right now. And the Cardinals, we talk about these virtual meetings, and a lot of what the Cardinals did in their communication virtually had nothing to do with football, did it?
No, and even us. I mean, last week we didn't feel like it was appropriate to do a podcast because of all the things going on, worldwide protest about race relations. So we felt like it would be best to take the week off and let, the spotlight be on that. Obviously, the NFL is majority black players. A lot of the players on the Cardinals and throughout the league have been very outspoken these last couple of weeks. And it was cool to hear Kliff Kingsbury be so unequivocal in his support of those players and say, whatever they want to do, however they want to talk and make action, he gives them his full support. And I thought that was neat to hear that, yeah, he's from a different background. He's a white guy, but he's listening to his players and realizing what they've gone through in their life is nothing compared to what he does. I mean, they've been through so many things and things that he didn't realize. So he called the experience enlightening.
And according to Coach Kliff, Darren, there were some emotional moments in the positional meetings when the players broke off with their position groups and their position coaches. And he said a lot of players open up and share personal anecdotes and personal stories where a lot of guys, in a lot of instances, could most definitely relate.
There's no question that a number of players, because of the color of their skin, are going to have experiences like that. He didn't get super detailed. He just said that those stories were told. He didn't tell any of them to us. And I think that's probably appropriate. That's one of those things where if the player wants to put it out there, he can. But I think it's good that dialogue is going on. I mean, we saw various players talking about, in various ways addressing this, whether it was Larry Fitzgerald's long essay in the New York Times, or even DeAndre Hopkins putting out a series of tweets where sometimes he doesn't have a whole lot to say himself. He's just quote tweeting something else that he wants to make sure gets some awareness. So I think this is an important time, not only in the NFL, but also in the world. And I like the idea of Kliff Kingsbury talking about how where we are right now, football is secondary, and what he wanted to make sure he and his coaches did was let players understand that if they needed to talk, if they needed to vent, if they needed to do whatever because of what's going on, that they wanted to be able to give them that platform within the team structure. And there will be time for football, but as Kliff Kingsbury said, this is also about mental health, and really, and I don't want to take anything away from the movement that's going on with the Black Lives Matters right now, but when you combine that and everything that people of color have been going through for years, and then you combine that with the COVID situation and people being cooped up and people losing jobs and people losing lives because of COVID. I mean, this is a hard time to be a human right now in a lot of ways. And when Kliff Kingsbury talks about mental health, when he's talking about his players, I mean, that's something you can talk about with any person in any walk of life with what they're going through right now. And so I think that's an important message to get across if you're a head coach.
You talk about platform, and then you see Larry and the essay that he wrote for the New York Times. And I'm quoting now, "We as a nation are not okay. We are not healthy." And Larry went on to talk about the violent death of George Floyd in police custody is yet another example, in his words, of a systemic problem we have yet to solve. We are not listening to each other. And Kyle, we've been waiting for Larry just because he's a Minneapolis native, and he explained that he wanted to be able to go back to his home state. Is that correct? Before he had something to say?
I think that's what he told the Arizona Republic. Yeah.
And to me, when you see Larry and then you see the way it resonated, I mean, shouldn't be any surprise, should it? And Kliff Kingsbury mentioned that, yes, it did get the national attention. I saw it darn near led SportsCenter that Sunday after Larry penned his essay.
Yeah, and there is a faction of people that want sports players and athletes to just simply stick to sports and not talk about societal issues, things that can get political. But the words of these stars have weight, and people listen when they talk. And I think any awareness is a good thing. And it certainly seems like Larry Fitzgerald thought a long time about what he wanted to say. He wanted to make sure he researched everything, so he wasn't putting an opinion out there that he wasn't comfortable with. And you respect that, because he wanted to think about everything from everybody's perspective, not say something off the cuff. And then when you do speak, you're going to put your entire force behind what you said and really stick by your opinion. So it was well received as anything Larry Fitzgerald does. And I think it does a lot for the Black community, because people that maybe didn't pay as much attention to the issue, it might get them looking at it because they've been a fan of Larry Fitzgerald for a long time. And hey, maybe we need to re-examine some of our thoughts.
Think about Darren, Larry Fitzgerald, the rookie, a 20-year-old, and how he was all football and wanted little to do with the media. And now he's writing an essay in the New York Times on one of the most integral parts in our nation's history. Think about that, and think of the voice he has now. If you go back to his rookie year, there's just no way. I never thought he'd be challenging theoretically for some of Jerry Rice's records, and I just didn't think that he would have this sort of voice on this sort of platform that would resonate so far beyond the game of football.
Well, Paul, you just mentioned, everybody was kind of waiting to hear what Larry was going to say on the subject, because he does matter. And it's because of where he is, and he's kind of like the elder statesman of the NFL in a lot of ways. And while there are some older quarterbacks that are around, he's, being an African-American, he is a Black voice that's been around and that can be there. And the other part about Larry is he does somewhat bridge that gap I guess you could say, in terms of his relationships with NFL ownership. We all know that he's very close with Michael Bidwell, and Michael Bidwell has made a strong effort the last few years to try and connect with the African Americans in the locker room and see how things can be improved in that direction. But Larry not only knows Michael really well, but because of his business interests, he has spoken at the NFL owners meetings. He knows a handful of NFL owners. I mean, I'm sure they all know him in at least a passing way, but he knows some of these business guys even better because he reaches out, because he's trying to look towards his future and wanting to be a high profile, well, maybe not high profile businessman, but he wants to be big in the business community down the road. So he knows these guys. And I always thought, like, here's a guy who can kind of bridge that gap, whatever it might be, between where the players might be and where the owners might be on some of these subjects. It's a difficult subject to maneuver right now when you start talking about business and racism. I mean, when I sit there, it feels very clear and cut to me what the right thing is, and to be anti-racism and to fix some of these systemic problems. But there are other factors, and we all know what a lot of them are. And, having Larry there to be able to address some of those with some of the most powerful people and have a relationship there, or at least have them notice what Larry Fitzgerald is putting in the New York Times, I think that means something.
And he hasn't been the only one who's been active, Kyle, as we saw with Patrick Peterson and DeAndre Hopkins in that video that implored the NFL to act out, speak out against racism, and it was effective. They got the response they were looking for from Roger Goodell, didn't they?
Absolutely. And it feels like it's 180 degrees different from Colin Kaepernick's stance in 2016 early on, when a lot of players weren't speaking out. I mean, I think a lot of players internally wrestled with, if I speak out, I know how much flack I'm going to take from certain segments of the fan base. Will it hurt my reputation, my marketability? And in 2020, it just feels like so many guys have lined up and said something either on social media or through other platforms. And it's been interesting to see the difference between those two kind of race-related subjects in a matter of 4 years. And I mean, almost every single high-profile Black person on the Cardinals has said something with a lot of substance in regards to race. And I think that's a big deal and something that can be transformative moving forward.
I mean, Darren, along with Pat P and DeAndre Hopkins, Corey Peters, Kenyon Drake, they have both been very vocal, right? And if we see, for example, Kliff Kingsbury was asked about the potential for players to kneel come the season and the national anthem, and the words he used was, well, whatever it is, and no one knows exactly what the season's going to look like, we're going to support our players. And I think that said it all, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean, I know on that subject, Kliff said that they hadn't really talked about anything yet, and we'll kind of have to see how this plays out, kind of like the COVID situation, where I feel like where we are as a country, both with this subject and COVID, it feels very week to week right now as we try and figure out what this brave new world might look like. So we'll have to see what happens. But I do think, again, circling all the way back to where we started with this, Kliff Kingsbury talking about the support that he wants to give players, that the organization wants to give players. I think that's meaningful, and I think that's important. Obviously none of us on this podcast know what it's like to be a Black man in this society, in this country. But I want to listen more. I feel like I have, but I think it's important to really listen and read and pay attention and do what we can on our sides of things to make this a better country for everybody.
So I try and tell the kids, I view that as my job, just to listen, to learn, educate yourself, try and be part of the solution. Try and instruct your kids accordingly. I try and pick out images. There was a little kid, probably about 6 years old, who was holding a sign in a protest, and it read, "It's not white versus Black. It's everybody against racism." And that was just one little snippet, one little sign, things that stand out that you try and pass along. I know Kenyon Drake, it was meaningful to him, and I'm sure a lot of other players, but he was the one who tweeted out that Kliff Kingsbury had given the team that Thursday off last week, Kyle, to honor the memory of George Floyd. And from what I could tell, just listening to Kliff Kingsbury, he's done a lot of what we're doing, and that is you try and listen and learn and provide the players with a platform.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not this humongous thing that somebody's doing, but like you said, the fact that he's willing to listen to them, he's showing them solidarity by saying, yeah, take this day off to honor George Floyd's memorial, and I think that resonated a lot with the players, where they said our coach may not have experienced the things we experienced, but he empathizes what we've gone through. He's listening to us. And I think in a time that is very divisive, that's something that can keep this team together, knowing that the coach does not demean you in any way, and he's willing to listen.
And when they do talk football, he also said about the virtual Zoom meetings that they're running out of things to talk about at this point without getting on the field, Darren. And I noticed that Matt Nagy of the Bears, he actually is going to end their virtual Zoom meetings for veterans a little bit later this week, that he's going to end it a week and a half early. And in his words, he said, we've accomplished so much, but I think you can translate that as there's not much left to do virtually. And so he's going to kick it. The Bears are, with the inability to get back in their facility at this point. Next time he's going to see them as training camp. Now the question is whether training camp might start a little earlier than usual to make up for some of the lost time in the off season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be the biggest thing. I mean, if you end a little bit early here, but it ends up that they try and bring the players back a week earlier than you normally could to try and get some of that field time, I think will be important. But I mean, Kliff made the great point. I mean, you want to have those reps on the grass, but if you can't get them, I mean, how much more are you going to be able to say? I mean, part of what goes on during OTAs and this off-season work is you're going to these meetings, you're installing the playbook, you go on the field, and then when you're running through the plays, that's when players are asking questions. That's when a coach, especially if it's a new thing that you didn't use the previous year in the playbook, if you're a coach and you see something and you notice, okay, maybe that's not going to work. And then your post-practice meetings or the meetings the next day or however you might structure them, then you can talk about legitimately what was happening on the field, and this is what's going to happen. And even in a perfect world where you're like going over the playbook, not being able to see it actual in real time is brutal. I mean, when a coach draws up, and we've gone through, Kliff has talked about it himself, but we've gone through many coaches who have done this before, offensive coaches who talk about, okay, I put this down on paper. It sounds really good on paper. When we're in the meeting room, when we drew it up, this looks really good. And then we get out on the field, and when we try and get actual human beings, even high-level athletes to run this thing, oh, wait a minute. It doesn't quite look that way. It can't quite be executed that way. Oh, this offensive lineman can't get from point A to point B quite as quickly as I envisioned him on paper. This isn't going to work. And that's what you're missing right now. And I think until we actually get on the field, it's going to be really tough to take any major more steps forward than what they've already been able to do in the meeting room.
And leave it to BA, Bruce Arians, to be quoted this week as saying that, you know what, now more than ever, in his opinion, it's the law of diminishing returns when you're only learning with today's young generation out of a book or off a screen. It's a must to get out there on the field for them to actually do it, experience it, touch it, feel it, run those plays. He said that's absolutely vital with today's generation, in BA's opinion. And with that in mind, Kyle, what do we know about the possibility of Kyler and DeAndre Hopkins and company getting together sometime soon?
Kliff Kingsbury does think it's going to happen. I think he said hopefully in a week or two, and I don't think he knows for sure, but it sounds like they're trying to get together. And is it a huge deal? Probably not, but I'm sure fans will be excited that DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray are starting to work together. I think it's different when it's routes on air, and I think the intricacies you might not be able to iron out when you're just doing that stuff. But any chemistry building, I'm sure they want to do, and even just getting to know each other on a personal basis. So I think that Kliff Kingsbury did mention that they're looking into that, and yeah, it's a good thing that they're trying to get that thing going and getting ready for camp.
To me, I'll be honest, Paul. Perhaps the chemistry part of like, shaking a guy's hand and getting to know him on a personal level, maybe that helps a little bit. I do feel like some of has Kyler thrown to his receivers / DeAndre Hopkins yet? I feel like a lot of that is steeped in the void of no sports boredom right now. I mean, I don't know how much it actually impacts things when you're going to lose the OTAs. I mean, to me, you do lose a little something if you don't have the OTAs, if he's not out there throwing within the framework of the offense. But if you're just talking about going to a field and having 5 or 6 pass catchers and then Kyler Murray backing off and throwing on air, I don't know how much you're really going to lose if that weren't to happen until training camp. That's just my personal feeling. And I just feel like some of it we've just gotten hooked on, and because God, we want some sign of actual on the field sports of some sort. And if it's the quarterback throwing to his new wide receiver, fine. But I don't know what kind of impact it actually would have.
I'm guessing DeAndre Hopkins has a pretty good mastery of the route tree on air, right? So I'm with you. How much do you really gain? Obviously, chemistry between a quarterback and a receiver is imperative, but are you going to be able to create that in that sort of setting? Unless it's a competitive situation, whether it's a training camp, whether it's a 7-on-7. I mean, and furthermore, chemistry to me really shows up between a quarterback and a receiver when the quarterback extends a play and things break down. And that's so hard to simulate except in a game situation as well. And are we all pretty confident DeAndre Hopkins knows how to find an open area in a zone on 3rd and 7 when Kyler's buying time? I would think so.
It's funny. I heard you guys speaking on 98.7 recently about, whether when they're talking about possibly going to the Fitz camps, which is when Larry has always gotten together some guys up in Minnesota to do that kind of stuff, and wouldn't they run specific Cardinal plays? I've been to one of those. No, they absolutely don't, because it's a mixture of, I mean, at least when I went there, and it's been a few years now, but I'm assuming it's about the same thing. I mean, unless he got all Cardinal people together, it's basically a situation where you're running a basic route. Okay, you're going to run the 7 and the in, or you're going to run the fly, or whatever it might be. You run the dig here, and you're throwing it on air. And if you happen to have a defensive back or defensive players that can do some coverage, you might have them out there. But it's all basic routes. You're not running anything from the playbook. You're not really using any of the verbiage that the Cardinals are going to use with what Fitz is doing. And in actuality, at least again when I was going up there, those workouts, the part where you're throwing the ball, that felt like one of the smallest parts about it. They went through a big, long part about doing the conditioning work, and they did a bunch of stuff in the weight room. They did throw the ball around, but it was like a third or a fourth of the time they were spending up there for the workouts. And so I think those kinds of things, they're not super specific to the team. Now, if it was all Cardinal guys together, like, once upon a time when Carson Palmer would get John Brown and Troy Nicholas and Ifani Moma together with Drew Stanton, and they were throwing some things. Yeah, you might have some Cardinal specific stuff, but when you don't have defensive backs and you don't have a pass rush, I mean, there's only so much you can accomplish anyways.
And Larry Fitzgerald did have that segment in Flight Plan when he was talking to Kyler Murray about, hey, throw the ball higher. He kind of likes the ball up there. Preferences like that, I think conversations between Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, that stuff could help. Like especially with a guy like Hopkins who has a big catch radius, who can get the 50-50 balls, and explaining to Kyler, hey, maybe I don't look open, but throw it in this area and I feel comfortable catching it. But I agree with Darren. I think the big part of the chemistry is maybe when a cornerback is working inside leverage and Hopkins has an option route. So, he's breaking out and Kyler Murray has to figure that out on the fly, and being on the same page in that situation is important, but on air, you don't have any of those scenarios.
You know what? If we can note to Jim Almohandra, if you can hook me up, and I'll return the favor later. I need Darren's answer on a clip that I can send to Ron Wolfley, because I was trying to explain to Wolf that how can they possibly run Cardinals playbook stuff when you're in the huddle with guys from different teams, guys from college programs. Now, I've never been, you have, Darren, but I've seen plenty of video of it because we sent our crews up there. So yes, it's a lot about conditioning. There's some competition. There's some throwing and there's some route running, but it's far from Cardinals specific when you're out there at the Larry camp, whatever you want to call it.
It's not OTA junior. It's just not that. Although Wolf's also the guy that's been essentially begging. I mean, Wolf was asking me as far back as early April if I thought Murray and Hopkins had gotten together. I know he desperately wants them to throw together. So, he's in a different plane with all this stuff.
By the way, speaking of Kyler, Coach Kingsbury was talking about how he can sense that Kyler's much more comfortable. What do you think that, Kyle? Is that a response to just persistent media questions? Do you think that's really apparent in virtual Zoom setting? Now, you are talking about a coach and a quarterback, and they've spent a lot of time together over the last year or so. But, can you really come up with that sort of assessment considering the circumstances right now?
Well, I do think it's the one position on the field where there is so much mentally. So maybe he is throwing things at him that he sees strides in about diagnosing defenses and things like that. I mean, he's got to answer the question, and I'm sure he does feel like he's more comfortable. We'll see exactly where he's at, but yeah, I mean, if you're seeing things after a year in the NFL, he can probably tell that Kyler Murray feels more comfortable, and I think we'll have a better idea when the season starts, when teams are doing things against him. But it's probably a positive sign that he does feel like he's getting it.
All right. Speaking of positive, Darren, here's a quote from Kliff Kingsbury. I like having a happy Pat P. I know we haven't accomplished anything yet, but I also like knowing that Patrick Peterson wants to be here to help build this thing. What'd you make of those comments from the head coach on his 8-time Pro Bowl corner?
Well, I would take that he's a smart man because as I had mentioned on a different radio broadcast at one point, Craig Grilu had asked me if the Cardinals are definitely going to be a good defense if Patrick Peterson is playing the way he's capable. And I don't know if I'm necessarily ready to say that they'll absolutely be a good defense if he's playing well. But I can tell you that if he plays poorly, they have no chance to be a good defense. And I do think that part of that equation for Patrick Peterson is his mental state of mind. And I think what we saw at the end of last year, I do think Patrick Peterson is capable of playing at that level. And I think he's going to get more comfortable in the Vance Joseph defense. I think they're using him in a way that he likes to be used in. That's part of this. But the bigger picture is I mean, when did Patrick Peterson's mood really go south? I mean, a lot of it was how the Steve Wilkes and Al Holcomb defense used him. And I understand that. And that was very frustrating, quite frankly, for a lot of defensive players. Ask Chandler Jones. But I think part of it was the losing. And he sees a path to not losing as much. And Patrick Peterson has always been somebody who wears his emotions on his sleeve. And when things are going well for him personally and with the team, he's better. And when the team really started to struggle, especially in the Wilkes era, and he felt he couldn't do anything about it, that's when things got kind of sideways for him. And then that kind of rolled through the suspension of last year. And I just think he's in a really good place right now. What's a little surprising to me is that he's doing it even though he's on a contract year and he probably wants that extension. And I didn't think he could get there, but I've been around Patrick Peterson his whole career, and I'm somebody who feels like while he can change, I'm not saying he can't change. I don't see him as being disingenuous. What you see is usually where Patrick is. And I think Patrick is exactly how he's portraying right now. He's in a good place. He's happy. He likes where this team is, and he has a lot of optimism. And I think that bodes well for this team because, again, mentally, that's where he needs to be a good player.
You know, if you're going to ask that question, where and when did things go south? To me, I have a specific memory, and it was the Thursday night loss against the Denver Broncos 2018, a lopsided loss on national TV, where the Cardinals used a lot of zone coverage. Pat P did not get his desired one-on-one matchup against Emmanuel Sanders, who went off for a 50-plus yard touchdown catch against a backup safety in zone coverage. There was a lot of frustration there. Von Miller had done a lot of talking. It all came to fruition on that night. Not only did the Cardinals lose, Pat P wasn't playing in a system that he thought suited his skill set. And he was looking at nearing a decade on his career, and where were the Cardinals in the arc of building a winner? And I think that all came together, at least for me, from the outside looking in, Kyle. And I think for Pat to be in a place where he's at now, to Darren's point, one, he's always going to be confident. Even when he came back from the suspension, You remember what he said? The P2 effect is here. And when he got the deflected interception in New York, right, he proclaimed the P2 effect again. But it's not the confidence. It has to be his buy-in. He has to believe in the system and the defense, and he has to believe, I think, in the ability of the team to compete. Those are all things that are ultra important to him. Those are the wild cards, I think, in setting his mood and what makes now a happy Pat P, according to Coach Kliff.
Yeah, and I think he just takes such immense pride in shadowing number one receivers, playing that press man coverage. I remember talking to him a couple years ago when he was at the height of his powers. I said, do you ever get bored, like just guarding a guy? And that was when teams would throw at him like once a game. I said, wouldn't you want to play zone and maybe trick a team and maybe get a pick six? He's just like, no, I love it. And having that taken away from him, he felt like he wasn't being used to his potential. And going into this season, it feels different now, where it does seem like it's going to go back to that type of system. But now the question is Patrick Peterson still elite after the way he played last year, the suspension? Now he's going to be 30 this season. I think that's where his mind frame is. He's motivated to show that I'm still one of the best corners in the NFL, and that's new for him. He's never needed that type of motivation. Everybody's always thought he's a top 3 corner, and now are you slipping? Are you falling? I think that's going to push him a lot in 2020.
Kyle, right back at you. How often do you think you're going to be writing about this contract storyline and Pat P and his contract year? Is this going to be a thing? Time and again during the 2020 campaign.
I think toward the end of the year, those things always pop up. And Patrick Peterson said a few weeks ago that he's not going to discuss it during the season. And if that's truly the case, then there isn't much to write about if he's not going to be in negotiations. But if they are open, or if he says anything about wanting to stay or wanting to leave, obviously it's going to be a topic. But every single year, high profile guys are heading into free agency. So I don't think it's much different than those guys because of his age. I think if he was 26 going into free agency, it would be a bigger discussion. And now being 30, it might be a harder one for the team to try to figure out his worth compared to what he thinks. But I don't think it's going to be an overpowering storyline.
What's intriguing to me, Darren, is he's never been here before. He's never been faced with a contract year. And you could hear how much of a motivating factor that was when he met the media recently for a good 50-plus minutes. He's acutely aware of it, and I think he's taken it as a real challenge to prove his worth.
Well, to be fair, I do think he's acutely aware of it, but to be fair to Patrick, he's going to be acutely aware of it because we're going to bring it up over and over and over and over, which partly is what happened in the media thing, is because we ask about it. But again, with everything that's happened with him and everything that's gone down and where he was as a mood and everything, I was actually a little bit surprised with how he addressed a lot of the contract stuff. I thought he'd be a little bit more reticent to go all in on some of this stuff, but he made it very clear. Look, do I want a new contract? Yes. Do I control that? No. And if I don't get one, I don't get one, and we'll kind of go from there. There are players that say stuff like that, and they're saying it to kind of like push away the questions and without getting too much into it or getting anybody riled up. Patrick's not really that one. I feel like he would have said a couple of things, maybe not outlandish, but he would have been a little bit more like, I expect to get a new contract, I'll be disappointed, whatever. And the fact he kind of was that, again, I think speaks to kind of where he is mentally. I think it actually feels like he is so enamored with what this team can be and being a part of it that for now, the contract is kind of in the back of his mind and he's not worrying about it too much. The other problem with the whole contract thing, whether it's Patrick Peterson or DeAndre Hopkins talking about possibly getting a new deal or whomever it might be, is being in the situation the NFL is and the Cardinals are going to be with COVID, with potentially fewer fans in the stands. We don't know how that's going to impact the salary cap. We don't know how teams are going to approach their roster building and contract extensions because there's so much uncertainty financially going forward. I saw one thing, and this doesn't have anything directly to do with Patrick Peterson, but I saw one cap expert tweet out recently that they felt like there was a chance that if things are go the way that this guy was kind of analyzing how they might, that there could be a flurry of veterans getting cut at the end of training camp veterans that normally wouldn't, but because they're going to be due a ton of money this season or next season, teams are just going to get rid of them. And there might be a flood of decent veterans on the market just because teams don't want to be on the hook financially given so much uncertainty.
That's interesting. I did not see that story. It's funny though, because my phone just went off with a story alert from NFL.com, and I read, ready for a year 2 jump in the AZ? And then it talks about the Cardinals homegrown player. Click here to find out who needs to take another step in 2020. Could that maybe, just maybe, be Byron Murphy, homegrown player? And I know, Kyle, you're sitting there going, Calvisi, where Paulie pandemic, where's my stinking numbers story? I need some analytics. And wasn't there, speaking of NFL.com, a story that came out and assessed the rookie season for Byron Murphy, and he allowed the second most receptions in the NFL last year? Is that the stat? Although he probably played among the most snaps of anyone in the NFL.
Yeah, I think Darren was the analytics guru on that one. He saw that stat. But yeah, I mean, we all saw it. I didn't realize he had given up that many, but we knew he struggled at times last season, and I think this is going to be a big year for him. He's moving into the slot where I think they feel more comfortable with him. I think he feels a little bit more comfortable playing nickel cornerback, and he wasn't just a second-round pick last year. He was the very first pick of the second round, so that's a lot of draft capital you spent on Byron Murphy. He plays a premium position. We can talk about Patrick Peterson all we want, but those other corners also need to play well. And Byron Murphy and Robert Alford are both question marks right now. So I think Byron Murphy probably learned a lot in his first year, and now he needs to translate that into becoming a more productive player.
I feel like watching Byron Murphy last year, for me, one of the things is if you go through your mental Rolodex, or at least when I do, it's not like he got beat deep. It was, he played it smart enough where he was giving up receptions in front of him, and then he was making the tackle. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're not giving up, touchdowns a lot of the time. That's good. I think, to me, the next step of his game is he's got to get to the point where he's comfortable not giving all that cushion and just giving up the catch and actually trying to get some passes defense and that kind of stuff. That felt like where Byron Murphy could probably improve the most from this layperson's kind of point of view. But I know they like Byron Murphy, and I do think he's a hard worker, and I do think he's going to work hard to get to where he needs to be. And I do think he'll be helped being in the slot, maybe having Patrick around for a whole season, having Robert Alford around to kind of give him some tips on the field. I think all those things can help. On the other side of the equation, just like we've talked about Kyler Murray missing out on these OTA reps, Byron Murphy is a guy who I think would have benefited, just like all last year's rookie class would have, with some of these extra reps after having played all those regular games. And he's going to miss out on that, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, no doubt. I think of Byron Murphy last year, and I think of a guy who should have been the number 3 corner at best. And then you have the season-ending injury to Robert Alford. You have the suspension of Pat P. And there you are in the first 6 games, and he's your number 1 corner. Instead of being hidden a little bit as a slot corner, he's out on an island. And to the point you guys made, he played it very safe. He didn't know what he didn't know until he found out for himself, and he didn't want to find out the hard way, trailing a receiver by 5 yards on an 80-yard touchdown bomb because he was in press man. So, yeah, he would give a lot of cushion, and there were a lot of throws in front of him. Obviously, they were targeting him. What's the rookie corner all about? So it was a tough deal for him. I heard someone say something along the lines of, if you give up that many receptions, could that be akin to a quarterback taking a battering behind a bad offensive line? And it's an interesting comparison, but to me, I don't think there's any fear of a Byron Murphy turning it into the next David Carr. It's not like he took a physical beating, and I don't think mentally he's going to have a hard time recovering because, at least to me, Kyle, he's got to understand all the factors. And we used to talk to him every week, and you're very close with him going back many years. I didn't notice – he's not Pat P when it comes to confidence, but I didn't notice the guy struggling in that department either.
Yeah, with Byron, it's not so much as like an ego type thing, but he's just kind of like a very chill guy who doesn't get wrapped up in what he gives up. I think he doesn't think to that extent. He thinks about what he has to do And then when the play's over, if he gave up a catch, if he didn't, if he wasn't targeted, whatever, I think he just moves on. So I don't think confidence is going to be the issue for him. I think playing nickel is pretty underrated because, like you said, he had to play on the outside last year, and he's guarding Julio Jones and these types of guys. And to me, Byron Murphy is more in this Tyrann Mathieu type mold where his foot speed isn't elite. It's more about his instincts, his change of direction. And that's why I think nickelback makes more sense for him, where he can be more of a playmaker there. So I think outside corner is a little bit wrong for his type of skill set. And I am interested to see if he can take that step at nickel, because then you have Budda Baker, Byron Murphy, and Isaiah Simmons all kind of patrolling the middle of the field. And if all three of those guys are playmakers, your defense is going to, thrive pretty well.
I know, Paul, why Kyle went to that description of Byron Murphy, because that's what everybody says about Kyle. Chill guy, doesn't really,
I write a bad story and I just brush it off.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, with the microphone, though, he makes adjustments. Like Kyle's game, he made an adjustment. The audio wasn't quite there, so he got the microphone a couple of weeks ago. So it's good. He learns on the job, doesn't make the same mistake twice. That's good.
That's the type of leap you want to see from Byron Murphy. Just follow my lead, Byron.
How old was Byron Murphy then? Let's do the math. When the Cardinals made their Super Bowl run. So he would have been like 11. Am I getting that right? Probably, right? Maybe even younger.
Right. 2008. Yeah, 2008.
Oh, younger. Yeah.
Younger.
Yeah.
Have you guys happened to catch any?
Paul.
How about Cardinals Archives? Have you caught any of Cardinals Archives, even a little bit of 98.7 FM Arizona Sports as we started with Cardinals games from the past and gone and the first few have been the postseason 2008 leading up to the Super Bowl, the NFC Championship. I mean, Darren, have you happened to catch any of that?
Wednesday night at 6 p.m. That's appointment listening, Paul, of course. First of all, I get to hear lots of Paul Calvisi, so that's big time. Then and now, Paul Calvisi. Your voice has changed a little bit, but that's okay.
That's right, because I've blown it out from coaching Little League Baseball. It's not nearly as quality as you. I tried to go into the studio and record some more sideline hits, and I wanted them edited in instead of Ron Wolfley. I wanted a little bigger presence in some of the, because Wolf never stops talking. But you know what my takeaway is? And we can get into all the particulars you want and all the great plays and all that. My big takeaway from hearing him so far is you can have a 20-game season that feels like 10 games if you're winning and you're making a Super Bowl run. It's just so much fun. And then look, we've had a couple of seasons the last couple of years and things are up and down, and it's cyclical in the NFL and every single sport, where you have a 16-game season that feels like 1,600 at times, okay? So it just, to me, Kyle, just reminds me of how much fun it is if you're able to go on a run and guys start to believe and you have a roster that can compete. Man, you look forward to every game.
Yeah, and I wasn't covering the team back in 2008, 2009, but obviously in 2015 I was covering them, and that run 2014, 2015, and leading up to the 2016 season with all the buzz about the team, those 3 years were pretty exciting, and that was a really good team. And that's how Patrick Peterson is feeling now, which is why there is kind of this momentum growing for the Cardinals, where maybe this is the start of a similar window, and we'll see if they can do it. But knowing that you've got the quarterback in place, you saw some good things, maybe you can harken back to that Super Bowl run sometime here in the next half decade.
Paul, you're absolutely right, and I hadn't thought about it in those terms in a long time. But the heaviness of the workload is absolutely less when the team is doing that well, because you're enjoying. And it was a little different too. With the 2015 team that made the NFC Championship as well as they played, we'd seen sparks of that in 2014, obviously, until Carson Palmer got hurt. So, the 2008 run came out of nowhere. They were, getting to 500 the year before. They had the great start. Then they went really bad. So that run just exhilarated everybody. And it's funny how that all goes. And to get to the NFC Championship game from the 2008 season. And by the way, I looked it up. Byron Murphy turned 11 years old the day the Cardinals beat the Eagles in the NFC Championship in January of 2009. But so there's that. But I mean, it was just the whole emotion of the game for the NFC Championship, for instance, that whole run. I mean, Larry Fitzgerald's postseason, it was just an amazing time.
You know, in the 2015 run, there was also the specter of the Tyrann Mathieu knee injury. And you know, and that sort of deflated things a little bit, because we all knew how integral he was to that team, how he was the heartbeat of that team in so many ways. Were they still talented? Absolutely. But there was that feeling of what could have been, whereas it was the complete opposite. You weren't a favorite. Chris Collinsworth had called you the worst playoff team in the history of the postseason. I mean, it truly was you against the world, those 2008 Cardinals and that Super Bowl run. And that just led to, you know, as you mentioned, the exhilaration, and you could hear it. You can hear in Dave Pasch's voice just the shock and awe of what the Cardinals were putting out there and what was going up on the scoreboard as they were making that Cinderella run and the whole shock the world thing with Kurt Warner. And that's why I was glad to see Peter King actually put the Cardinals 18th in their power poll. That, you know, maybe at least a little sobering reality, because we've heard a lot of accolades this offseason and for fear. And I know Ron Wolfley's more about this than maybe any of us, but, you know, the Cardinals perhaps getting over their skis a little bit just based on some of the offseason projections and predictions and so forth. So I actually liked it that Peter King, Kyle, kept the Cardinals a little more grounded, albeit as much as you can get out of a June power poll.
You think, I hope these guys are not affected by power polls. Like, who cares what people say? Yeah, the expectations are going to be higher. That's not going to affect one thing about the play on the field. These guys are professional athletes. Yeah, maybe they like it or maybe they don't like it that people are going to be talking about them, but you go on the field and you play football and the better team usually wins.
So as we come full circle, and I mentioned that, you know, we do have one thing in common with the coaches. Ever tell you guys about the time that I was actually mistaken for a Cardinals coach down on the field?
No, you did not.
Not a player?
Thanks for asking. It was at Houston, and it was back when Clancy Pendergast was the defensive coordinator, and it was like 2 hours before kickoff. And I'm talking to Clancy down on the field, and the late Bob McNair, who was an unbelievably warm person, who came up and started talking, and he came up and introduced himself. Coach. I still remember the look Clancy gave me. And just how personally insulted I think he was from the inside out of being me being in the same classification of him down on a football field.
You didn't have a mustache at the time, though, right?
It's true. That's true. I would undermine my validity as a coach. You're absolutely right.
Because he would have come up to you and said, Coach, late inning reliever, you know, probably instead.
That's right. Then now they come up and just give me the baseball. They go, here, take over as the setup man. That's what they do. Although Kyle's off-season facial hair is, you know, it's pretty good, Kyle, over there. It's not bad, you know.
Thank you.
Well, nobody can beat Chris Melvin's beard right now. I don't know if you've seen Chris Melvin lately, but
I did see that. That's a keeper, actually. He's getting compliments on that, right? Unlike mine, people actually encouraging him to keep his. Yeah,
Chris Melvin, director of media relations for the Cardinals, decided to just throw in the towel and never shave, and it's worked out for him.
It's good. Well, you know, he's from Motown. He's a little old school. He's rocking his Bob Seger look, you know, going back to the 1970s, you know. So, all right, that'll do it for Cardinals Underground.